every important moment of my life, my family wasn't there. Not on my birthday, not the day I got my first great result, not even the day I got promoted at work. I'd sit alone, telling myself, maybe they're busy, maybe next time they'll remember. But when my sister had even the smallest piece of good news, the whole family would come together like it was the biggest event in the world. I fought alone for years. No help from anyone. No love from anyone. Just my own strength carrying me through. But when my company's valuation hit $150 million, the very next morning, my phone started ringing, one call after another. Voices I'd almost forgotten I knew. And then came a message. From my mother. Family dinner Sunday, 7 p.m. There's something important we need to talk about. I stared at that message for a long time. After all these years of silence, why the sudden urgency? I didn't know what was waiting for me at that dinner table. I just knew one thing. I wasn't walking in there empty-handed. In my bag, I was carrying something. Something I didn't even know yet exactly how I'd use that night. If you enjoy stories about family neglect, karma, and justice finally catching up to people who thought they'd gotten away with it, subscribe to Air Nova and stay with me. My name is Eleanor, and for most of my life, I understood exactly where I stood in my family, even if nobody ever said it out loud. I grew up in a quiet suburb outside Sacramento, in a house that looked, from the outside, like any other normal family lived there. My parents, Robert and Diane, my younger sister Chloe, 2 years behind me, Sunday dinners, holiday photos on the mantle. To anyone looking in, we probably seemed like a picture-perfect family. But inside those walls, there was a pattern I learned to recognize before I was even old enough to understand what it meant. Chloe was the golden child. I don't say that bitterly, it was just a fact of life in our house, as certain as the sun rising. When Chloe brought home a B on a test, my parents celebrated like she'd cured a disease. When I brought home straight A's, my mother would glance at the report card and say, "That's what we expect from you, Eleanor," and move on to ask Chloe about her day. I remember my 10th birthday clearly. My mother had promised a small party, just a few friends from school, a cake, nothing extravagant. That morning, Chloe had a minor meltdown about a dress she wanted for a school event that wasn't even happening for another 2 weeks. By the time evening came, my birthday party had quietly been postponed, so my parents could take Chloe shopping instead. It was never rescheduled. Nobody ever brought it up again. That became the blueprint for the next 2 decades of my life. When I graduated high school as valedictorian, my parents came to the ceremony, but left immediately afterward because Chloe had a soccer game across town. I stood there in my cap and gown, watching them walk away before I even got to take a single photo with them. When I got into a competitive university on a partial scholarship, something that took me months of essays and applications to earn, my mother's first response was, "That's wonderful, honey. Did I tell you Chloe made the cheer squad?" I stopped expecting anything after a while. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't some big blow-up or a single moment where I decided to give up on them. It was just a slow, quiet erosion, year after year, where I learned to celebrate my own wins alone, because waiting for someone else to notice only left me disappointed. By the time I turned 25, I was living alone in a small apartment 2 hours from my parents' house, working a corporate job that paid the bills but never felt like mine. On my birthday that year, I bought myself a cupcake from the grocery store, sat on my couch, and waited to see if anyone would call. Nobody did. Not until 3 days later, when my mother texted asking if I could pick up a birthday gift for Chloe, since apparently I always had a good eye for presents. I remember staring at that text for a long time before I finally understood something clearly, maybe for the first time in my life. I wasn't just being overlooked. I had a role in this family, and that role wasn't daughter. It was useful. That same year, I quietly started building something of my own. A small software idea I'd been sketching out during my lunch breaks, something that could help small businesses manage their inventory without needing an entire IT department. I didn't tell my family. Not because it was some secret plan for revenge, but because I'd simply stopped expecting them to care. I worked on it nights and weekends for almost 2 years before it started gaining any real traction. I remember the first time a client actually paid for the software, a small local bakery that needed better stock tracking. I sat in my apartment that night and cried, not because of the money, which was barely a few $100s, but because for the first time in my life, something I built entirely on my own had actual value. I never told my parents about that first sale. I never told them about the second client, or the 10th, or the 50th. Somewhere along the way, keeping this part of my life private had become its own kind of protection. What I didn't know yet was just how much that quiet, overlooked project was about to grow, or how quickly my family's silence would turn into something else entirely, the moment the rest of the world started paying attention to what I'd built. The software business, which I'd started calling Ledger Loop, kept growing steadily over the next 2 years. Slowly at first, then with a little more momentum every quarter. I hired my first employee, a developer named Marcus, who believed in what I was building almost as much as I did. Then a second, then a third. I still didn't tell my family much. Whenever the topic came up at the rare family gathering I attended, I'd give some vague answer, "It's going okay, just a small tech thing," and watch my mother's eyes glaze over before she turned the conversation back to Chloe, who by then had started a jewelry business that mostly existed on Instagram and never seemed to turn a profit. I remember one Thanksgiving in particular. I'd just closed our biggest contract yet, a deal with a regional retail chain that would triple our revenue. I was exhausted, proud, running on almost no sleep from the weeks of negotiations. I drove 2 hours to my parents' house that day, hoping, foolishly, that maybe this would be the year someone asked a real question about my life. Instead, the entire dinner revolved around Chloe's latest boyfriend, a man named Trevor who apparently had so much potential, despite not having held a steady job in over a year. My father toasted to Chloe finding happiness. My mother teared up talking about how proud she was watching Chloe figure out her path. Nobody asked me a single question about my work that entire evening. When I finally mentioned, quietly, that we'd just signed a major client, my mother said, "That's nice, sweetie," before immediately turning back to ask Chloe if Trevor was joining us for Christmas. I left that dinner early, sat in my car in their driveway for almost 20 minutes before I could bring myself to drive home. I didn't cry. By that point, I'd stopped crying over these things years earlier. I just sat there, feeling that same familiar hollow feeling, the one that had followed me since I was 10 years old and my birthday party got quietly canceled. Around that same time, I went through a breakup that genuinely broke something in me. A relationship I'd been in for almost 3 years, someone I thought I might actually build a life with. When it ended, badly, suddenly, I called my mother, something I rarely did anymore. I needed, just once, to hear someone tell me it would be okay. She listened for about 4 minutes before mentioning that Chloe was going through something similar, and maybe the two of us should talk, since we could support each other. I hung up shortly after that, sat alone in my apartment for the rest of the night, and made a decision I'd been circling for years without fully admitting it to myself. I stopped trying. Not in a dramatic way. I didn't cut anyone off or make some big announcement. I just quietly stopped reaching out first. Stopped sharing updates about the business. Stopped hoping that the next milestone would finally be the one that made them notice me. I threw everything I had left into Ledger Loop instead. If my family wasn't going to see me, I decided the rest of the world eventually would. The next 2 years were a blur of work. 16-hour days became normal. I moved into a smaller apartment to save money and put almost everything back into the company. We landed 2 more major clients, then a partnership with a logistics company that put our software in front of thousands of new potential customers. Somewhere in there, without fully realizing it was happening, Ledger Loop stopped being a small idea I'd sketched out during lunch breaks and became an actual company with 40 employees, an office space downtown, and investors who were starting to take real notice. I still didn't tell my family much. At this point, it had become second nature, keeping this entire part of my life separate from them, almost like it belonged to a different version of me they'd never met. I saw them maybe 3 or 4 times a year, mostly around holidays, mostly out of a sense of obligation rather than genuine desire. Every visit followed the same pattern. Chloe's latest venture, whatever it happened to be that year, dominated every conversation. My mother would ask me one polite, surface-level question about work, nod through whatever brief answer I gave, then pivot back to Chloe within 30 seconds. I stopped correcting them when they got basic facts about my work wrong. I stopped explaining what my company actually did. It simply wasn't worth the energy anymore. There was one moment during this period that stayed with me longer than most. My father had a minor health scare, nothing life-threatening, but enough to land him in the hospital overnight for observation. I drove 2 hours the second I heard, sat in that waiting room until 3 in the morning, terrified something worse was happening. When he was finally stable and I stepped into his room to see him, the first thing my mother said, before even acknowledging I'd made the drive, was, "Did you know Chloe couldn't come because she had an early morning meeting? She felt so guilty. Nobody thanked me for showing up." Nobody mentioned that I'd been the one who drove through the night while Chloe, apparently, was asleep in her own bed 2 hours away. I sat with my father for a while that night, just the two of us, since my mother had stepped out to get coffee. He looked at me and said quietly, almost like an apology, "You've always been the steady one, Eleanor. You don't need us to worry about you the way we worry about Chloe." I didn't say anything back. I just nodded and let him believe that was some kind of compliment, even though it felt, in that moment, like the most honest confirmation I'd ever gotten of exactly where I stood. By the time Ledger Loop's valuation crossed $50 million, quietly, without any real fanfare outside our small industry circle, I'd stopped expecting my family to ever fully see me. I'd built an entire identity, an entire life, that existed almost completely outside of them. What I didn't know yet was that all of that quiet distance was about to be tested in a way I never could have predicted. Because the moment my name and my company's valuation showed up somewhere they couldn't ignore, everything about how my family treated me was about to change overnight. The turning point came from a direction I never expected. A journalist from a mid-sized business publication reached out about a piece she was writing on overlooked founders in the tech industry, people who'd built successful companies without the traditional venture capital pipeline or Silicon Valley connections. Someone on our board had mentioned my name to her, almost as an afterthought during an unrelated conversation. I almost said no to the interview. Publicity had never been something I chased, mostly because I'd learned not to expect recognition from anyone, let alone strangers. But Marcus, who'd become more of a business partner than an employee by that point, convinced me it could be good for the company. So I agreed. The interview itself was simple enough. She asked about my background, how I'd started the company, what it felt like building something from nothing without outside funding in the early years. I answered honestly, without dressing anything up. I mentioned, briefly, that I'd built the company largely on my own, without much family support, though I didn't go into detail about what that actually meant. The article ran a few weeks later. It was well written, respectful, focused mainly on the business side of things. I didn't think much of it at the time. It got some traction within industry circles, a modest bump in inbound inquiries, nothing dramatic. What I didn't anticipate was what happened next. A larger financial publication picked up the story a month later, this time framing it around a broader piece about companies experiencing unexpected rapid growth in the software infrastructure space. Ledger Loop was mentioned as one of several companies to watch. That article included a rough estimate of our current valuation, based on our last funding round and revenue growth. $150 million. I remember staring at that number on my laptop screen at 2 in the morning, unable to fully process it. We'd grown so steadily, so gradually, that I hadn't stopped to look at the full picture in months. Somewhere between the 16-hour days and the client calls and the constant problem-solving, the company had become something far bigger than the small idea I'd sketched out during lunch breaks all those years ago. Then, a week after that, everything accelerated. A reporter from Forbes reached out, wanting to do a feature specifically on me and the company's growth trajectory. This time, the interview was longer, more in-depth, focused heavily on my personal story, the years of building alone, the lack of traditional support, the sheer persistence it took to get here. I answered every question honestly. I didn't dramatize anything. I simply told the truth about what those years had actually looked like. The article published on a Tuesday morning. I remember exactly where I was when it went live, sitting at my desk, coffee going cold beside me, reviewing quarterly projections with Marcus in the conference room next door. My phone started buzzing around 9 in the morning. At first, I assumed it was work-related, investors or clients reacting to the piece. But as the morning went on, the calls kept coming, and slowly, I started recognizing the names. An aunt I hadn't spoken to in almost 4 years. A cousin who'd unfriended me on social media after some minor family dispute I couldn't even fully remember the details of anymore. A former family friend who used to babysit Chloe and me when we were kids. By early afternoon, my phone had more missed calls than I'd received in the previous 6 months combined. I sat there scrolling through the notifications, feeling strangely disconnected from all of it, like I was watching this happen to someone else. None of these people had reached out during the years I actually needed them. Not during the 16-hour days. Not during the breakup that broke something in me. Not during the countless holidays where my work was dismissed in favor of whatever Chloe happened to be doing that season. Now, apparently, a number in a magazine article was enough to make my phone impossible to ignore. Around 4 that afternoon, a text came through from my mother. I'd almost expected it by that point, though seeing her name on my screen still sent a strange, complicated feeling through my chest. Family dinner Sunday, 7 p.m. We need to talk about something important. No mention of the article, no congratulations, no acknowledgement of the years of silence that had preceded this exact moment. Just an instruction, delivered the same way she might have texted about picking up groceries. I sat with that message for a long time before responding. Part of me wanted to ignore it entirely, to finally close the door on a relationship that had cost me more than it had ever given back. But another part of me, the part that had spent 28 years quietly hoping for something different, needed to see exactly what this dinner was actually about. I typed back 3 words, "I'll be there." What I didn't tell her was that I wouldn't be walking into that dinner the same way I had every other family gathering for the past decade. Quiet, accommodating, hoping for scraps of attention. This time, I was bringing something with me. Something that had been sitting in a folder on my desk for almost a year. Something I'd never had a reason to use until now. Sunday arrived faster than I expected. I spent most of the day going over the contents of that folder one more time, even though I'd already memorized every page inside it. 3 years earlier, shortly after my grandmother passed away, I'd stumbled across something during a routine review of old family financial documents, back when I was helping my parents organize paperwork for her estate. My grandmother had left a modest trust, meant to be split evenly between Chloe and me, money she'd specifically set aside for either of our futures, whichever one of us needed it first. I'd found the original documentation by accident, tucked inside an old filing cabinet at my parents' house. According to that paperwork, the trust had been split as intended, half to me, half to Chloe. Except I'd never received a cent. When I quietly asked my mother about it at the time, she brushed it off, said the money had gone toward family expenses, and that I hadn't really needed it anyway, since I was doing fine on my own. What I later discovered, digging deeper on my own over the following months, was that my entire portion had actually gone directly into funding Chloe's first failed business attempt, a boutique clothing line that folded within a year. My parents had used my inheritance, without asking, without telling me, to bail out a venture that never had a real chance to begin with. I never confronted them about it. At the time, I told myself it wasn't worth the fight, that pushing the issue would only cause more damage to a relationship that already felt fragile. I filed the documents away and buried the anger somewhere deep enough that I could function around my family without constantly thinking about it. I hadn't planned on ever bringing it up again. But sitting in my car outside my parents' house that Sunday evening, that folder resting on the passenger seat beside me, I realized I wasn't walking in there to relive old grievances for the sake of it. I was walking in prepared, because some part of me already suspected exactly what this dinner was going to be about. I was right. The dinner started normally enough. My mother had made a large meal, more elaborate than usual, the kind of spread she typically reserved for holidays. My father made a few comments about the Forbes article, awkward, surface-level compliments that felt more obligatory than genuine. Chloe sat across from me, unusually quiet, picking at her food. It wasn't until dessert that my mother finally addressed the reason behind the sudden invitation. "Eleanor," she said, setting down her fork carefully, "we wanted to talk to you about something important. Chloe's new business, the wellness brand she's been building, it's hit a rough patch. She needs an investment to get through the next few months. We were hoping, given everything you've accomplished, that you might be able to help." I sat there for a moment, letting the request settle fully before responding. "How much?" I asked. My mother glanced at Chloe before answering. $200,000. I didn't respond right away. I let the silence sit in the room for longer than was comfortable, watching my mother's expression shift slightly, the confidence in her request starting to waver. "Let me understand this correctly," I finally said. "You didn't call me when I graduated at the top of my class. You left my birthday party plans behind because Chloe wanted a dress. You didn't ask a single question about my company for 4 years. But now, you want $200,000. My father shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Chloe stared down at her plate, refusing to meet my eyes. "That's not fair, Eleanor," my mother said, her voice tightening. "Family helps family. We're asking because we know you can afford it now." "Funny," I said, reaching down and pulling the folder out of my bag, setting it gently on the table in front of me. "Because we've already had this conversation before. You just don't remember it. Because I was the only one in the room." I slid the folder across the table toward her. "Grandma's trust," I said quietly. "The half that was supposed to come to me. I know exactly where it went." The room went completely silent. My mother's face drained of color as she opened the folder, scanning the documents inside. Documents she clearly hadn't expected to ever surface again. "You used my inheritance to fund Chloe's boutique," I continued, my voice steady, despite the tightness building in my chest. "The one that failed within a year. Nobody ever told me. Nobody ever asked me. And when I found out on my own, I stayed quiet, because I convinced myself it wasn't worth losing what little relationship we had left." Chloe finally looked up, her eyes wide, genuinely stunned. "I didn't know," she said quietly. "I swear, Eleanor, I didn't know that money was yours." I believed her, honestly. Chloe had likely never questioned where the funding for her first business came from, the same way she'd never questioned why every family celebration seemed to center around her. That's the problem. I said, looking around the table at all three of them. None of you ever had to question it. Because I was always the one who didn't need anything. The one who could handle things on her own. The one who didn't require attention, or support, or even basic acknowledgement. My mother closed the folder slowly, her hands trembling slightly. Eleanor, we're sorry. We didn't realize how this looked. You didn't realize, I repeated. For 28 years. I stood up from the table, the folder still resting in front of my mother, exactly where I'd left it. I'm not giving Chloe $200,000, I said calmly. I already gave her half of an inheritance I never even got to use myself. That debt was paid a long time ago, whether any of you acknowledged it or not. I left my parents' house that night without saying much else. There wasn't anything left to say that hadn't already been said, sitting there in that folder, in the silence that followed, in the years of small moments that had finally added up to something impossible to ignore. I didn't hear from anyone in my family for almost 3 weeks after that dinner. No calls, no texts, nothing. Honestly, the silence felt different this time. Not the familiar ache of being overlooked, but something closer to relief. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for anyone to reach out. I'd said what needed to be said, and whatever happened next was no longer something I felt responsible for managing. Then, almost a month later, I got a call from an old family friend, someone who still kept in occasional contact with my parents. She mentioned, carefully, almost hesitantly, that things had gotten complicated at home. Apparently, after that dinner, Chloe's wellness business had collapsed entirely within weeks, the $200,000 shortfall proving impossible to cover through any other means. But that wasn't the real story. The real story, according to this friend, was what came out afterward. It turned out Chloe hadn't just been struggling with one failed venture. She'd quietly taken out several loans over the past 2 years, using our parents' house as informal collateral, promises made verbally, never fully disclosed to anyone outside of Chloe, and, apparently, my father, who'd co-signed on more than one occasion without telling my mother the full extent of it. When the wellness business folded, those debts came due all at once. My parents were suddenly facing the very real possibility of losing their home, the same house I'd grown up in, the same house where that dinner had taken place just weeks earlier. I found out later that Chloe had disappeared from all of it almost immediately, once the financial pressure became real. She'd moved in with her boyfriend Trevor's family 2 states away, cutting off most contact, leaving my parents to untangle the mess largely on their own. My mother called me eventually, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it, asking if we could talk. I agreed to meet her for coffee, not because I felt obligated, but because some part of me was genuinely curious what she had to say, now that the version of the family she'd spent decades protecting had finally come apart on its own. She looked older than I remembered, sitting across from me at that small coffee shop, her hands wrapped tightly around a cup she never actually drank from. I don't know how we got here, she said quietly. I keep thinking about that dinner, about everything you said. I didn't want to believe it at the time. But watching everything with Chloe fall apart the way it has, I think I finally understand what you were trying to tell me. I didn't say anything right away. I let her continue. We always thought Chloe needed more from us, she said. More attention, more support, more protection. And somewhere along the way, we convinced ourselves that meant you needed less, that you were strong enough to handle things on your own, so we never had to worry. I was strong enough, I said finally, because I had to be, not because I wanted to be. She nodded slowly, tears gathering in her eyes. I'm sorry, Eleanor. I don't expect that to fix anything. I just needed you to hear it. I sat with that apology for a long moment, turning it over, trying to decide what it actually meant to me now, after everything. I appreciate you saying that, I said honestly, but I'm not going back to how things were. I spent almost 30 years hoping for a version of this family that was never actually there. I can't keep doing that anymore. My mother didn't argue. She just nodded again, quietly accepting something that had probably been true for a very long time, long before either of us was ready to say it out loud. I still see my parents occasionally now, though the relationship looks nothing like it used to. Smaller, more honest, fewer expectations on either side. My father reached out separately a few months later, apologizing in his own quieter way, taking more responsibility for the loans he'd co-signed without telling anyone the full truth. Chloe and I haven't spoken since that dinner. I don't know if we ever will again, and for the first time in my life, I've made peace with the possibility that we might not. Ledger Loop crossed 200 million in valuation about 8 months after that dinner. I remember sitting in my office the day we hit that number, thinking back to that 10-year-old girl waiting for a birthday party that never happened, wondering if she'd ever imagine ending up here. I didn't call my family to tell them. There was no urgency in that anymore. No lingering hope that this particular milestone would finally be the one that made everything different. I'd stopped measuring my worth by whether they noticed. I bought a house of my own last spring. Nothing extravagant, just a quiet place with a garden I actually have time to take care of now. Marcus and I expanded the company into a second office last year, and most days, I genuinely love the work I get to do. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about that folder, the one I carried into my parents' house that Sunday evening. I think about how long I carried that silence, convinced that speaking up would cost me more than staying quiet ever did. I was wrong about that, in the end. The silence had already been costing me everything. I just hadn't been willing to see it. I don't regret walking away from the version of my family that only saw me when there was something to gain. I don't regret refusing to hand over money I'd already given, quietly, without ever being asked, for the first 28 years of my life. What I've learned, more than anything, is that being needed and being valued are not the same thing. For most of my life, I confused the two, believing that if I just worked hard enough, achieved enough, stayed quiet enough, eventually someone would look at me the way they looked at Chloe. Nobody ever did, not until the number next to my name became too big to ignore. And by then, I'd already learned to see myself clearly, with or without their attention. If you enjoyed this story, and if you believe in family accountability, quiet strength, and building a life on your own terms, don't forget to subscribe to Air Nova. There are so many more stories like this one waiting for you.